And thank you all for joining on this grey Tuesday afternoon here in Wellington, looking out over the beehive. Today we're going to be talking about carbon and climate reporting. And so I'll be talking a little bit about some of the most common questions that we're getting at the moment around reporting on carbon emissions, show you some good examples, and then I'm also just going to talk a little bit about what to think about when reporting and talking about your carbon emissions in terms of COVID. Some of you might have quite large reductions in emissions over the lockdown period, and so I'll give you some tips on how you can talk about that. Also talk a little bit about how you can talk about your targets if your pathways have changed as a result of the COVID-19 lockdown. So hopefully some good tips. And again, any questions on that, just please pop them in the questions and we'll bring them up for discussion later. And I've also got my lovely colleague Joseph from CDP who's going to talk about CDP reporting and also talk a little bit about the TCFD and how the CDP and TCFD align. So I know there's a lot of interest and we're getting a lot of questions about that at the moment as well. So I'm really happy to have him on board today to hopefully bring some clarity on that too. And for those, just as really quickly, so TCFD is a task force for climate disclosures, and there have been some consultation on whether New Zealand government should make that mandatory for listed companies in New Zealand. Obviously it's election year, so we're still in the unknown of what actually will happen, but it is certainly a topic that's on the agenda for a lot of businesses at the moment. So anyway, let's just kick off. Toitū, just really quickly about us. We are a subsidiary of Manaki Whenua Landcare Research, and we've been operating since 2011. And we have majority of our businesses here in New Zealand that we work with, but we also work with quite a lot of organizations in the UK via the Achilles Information Group. And of course, we do have some members over in Australia as well, but majority of our members are here in New Zealand. And I think we're probably absolutely most famous for our carbon reduce and carbon zero programs, which are carbon reporting and measure and manage programs, helping you to understand what your footprint is for your carbon footprint of your business and help you reduce those emissions over time. Today we're just going to cover quickly on your reporting, and I'll hand over to Joe once I'm covered on my bits and tips and so on. Just really quickly on why to report. One of the main things that comes out on the reasons why you should be reporting on your carbon emissions is accountability. And I should say connected to that is transparency as well. Reporting can actually drive accountability. Often you need somewhat of a robust or I guess a clear account of what your impacts on the environment or what your carbon footprint is before you actually report. And sustainability managers can sometimes use it as a tool by publicly talking about carbon emissions. Sustainability managers can get that tool internally to drive and build engagement on carbon reducing activities. Been the likes of, well, we've said it publicly, so now let's get on to it and reduce those emissions. But of course as well, it can drive performance. You have a lot of organizations at the moment being pressured, I guess, to have larger transparency on what the environmental impacts of the business are. And that's not only from stakeholders internally, but also from external stakeholders. Of course, reporting on your impacts will show leadership. You future-proof your business as well, and particularly, and I'll show you in a second about that, we covered that on last week. But you also facilitate buy-in for carbon management programs. But the big thing that we're seeing at the moment is supplier requirements and stakeholder and investment requirements. We have a lot of our members that are being asked questions, and one thing that I covered in last week's seminar was around stakeholder and supplier questions. And one big thing is for organizations that are setting science-based targets, one of the main things that they're doing in the scope 3 area, so that's your indirect greenhouse gas emissions, and they're asking their suppliers to disclose on their scope 1 and 2 emissions as I guess a basic, if you look at the ladder you've got here in front of you, as one of the basic criteria. So for organizations, so your large organizations around the globe that have set science-based targets, they can and are likely to start asking their suppliers. So if you are in that supply chain, you might be asked about disclosing your emissions. And then as you see there, as a start, you might be asked for your scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are your direct emissions, but then that could potentially lead to them asking for scope 3 emissions. So reporting on them obviously will help you to cover off on some of those questions and save you time. And of course, future-proofing your business, so you're already ready for those questions once they start dropping in. And we have had quite a few members that are part of global supply chains that have started having questions from larger buyers around the globe around their carbon emissions. So some of the prerequisites for reporting that I want to mention really quickly is if you have got a good data set or I guess information on activities and accounts of data sources in your organization, then that's obviously your first step. If you haven't gotten to that step just yet, then I would recommend that you start looking at what are some of the things that we can measure. Are there some things that are quite obvious? And I'll give you some tips of where you can turn to start that journey if that's not something that you're on just yet. But getting the data will give you the tools to understand where you're at and what are some of the things that you can report on. And that could also help you decide whether are we reporting on the things that have happened or where we're at today, or should we also be talking about what the journey is that we've been on so far, and have we seen any improvements, or do we predict any improvements in the future? You want to make sure that you have confidence in that information. We recommend that you would at least have it verified for at least the base year, so that just so you know that you're talking with the quality data set behind it. Because of course, once you have communicated out publicly, you want to make sure that you can rely on those numbers that you have reported. And also, when you are talking about your carbon emissions, if you have had it third-party verified or independently reviewed, you'd want to mention that in there potentially. And so that's one thing to just consider as well. And of course, if you have aligned your inventory or your carbon information or data with a particular standard, then a lot of organizations like to include that in the information about when they talk about their carbon emissions as well. So that's another recommendation. I've included here, Greenhouse Gas Protocol has a set of guidelines on how to both measure but also report on carbon emissions. Obviously the ISO standard, which all of our members who are in the Carbon Reduce and Carbon Zero program are aligned to. So that's the ISO 14064. And a great free resource on if you just want to get started on understanding your carbon footprint, have a look at the Ministry for the Environment's free guidance on voluntary greenhouse gas reporting. These are all linked in the presentation. And of course, the last one is if you have a certification, a lot of organizations like to talk about that in their public reports as well. So that is very worth just considering as a few first steps. I am going to show you a few examples of reports of Kiwi Business. I've got Littleton Port here. They have included some comments on what their targets are, but also what their main sources are. So at the top here, you'll see they've got broken down by fuel, electricity, and freight. And they've mentioned what their total emissions are and what their targets are. And this is from their annual report. So, when you start thinking about where you might want to talk about your carbon emissions, there are a few different areas where you might want to do that. And one of the most common ones, I would say, is in your annual reports. Another example here is Somerset. They talk about their carbon footprint in their annual report. And here's an example of they mentioned that they have a certified inventory. And they also talk about when the first year of them being certified was, and included in the annual report as well. And they've also mentioned a little bit about what their targeted reductions will be over time. And again, also broken down their inventory to a few main groups here to make it easy for the readers to understand where their main emission sources are. Another example is Kathmandu. They have mentioned here, they talk a little bit about how it's been audited and certified as well. So these are examples of where you might want to include some of that information. And some organizations also like to talk about what standard they've been verified to, particularly if they know that they have organizations in their supply chain that are interested in that. And another example here is a 3R group, which talking a little bit about their carbon footprint. They do that on their website. So this is an example from their website where they have a little tab about sustainability on there. So that's another option you can do. They also, because they offset their emissions, they've also included a little bit of information on where they offset and how they've done that. So that's quite nice to include as well if you are doing that. I would say if you are thinking about reporting or you want to try to improve the reports, you're not really happy with the way they're looking at the moment, I've got a few recommendations. And the first one will be to have a look at websites of businesses that you like or that you think produce nice, whether that's content online or products or that you just like to support. So have a little think about if there are any of those that you could have a look at and see what they're doing. The other thing is for any organization that's been certified by Toitū, they have a disclosure page on our website, so you can go in and have a look there about their certifications, and it'll give you a little bit of an insight on what their emissions are, what they're doing to reduce them, and how long they've been certified for. So that's a good example as well. And also if you are considering buying from a particular organization or you're just curious, that's a good way to start as well. And then another option as well is to just look at annual reports. And for listed organizations and those that do produce annual reports, it has become a lot more popular over time to include carbon information and even environmental impact information in those reports. So again, looking at some of the ones that you think are interesting or that you have an eye for already, really recommend that you have a look at what they've done with their reports. And one tip that I think not everyone thinks about, but is that the Science Based Target has a tool where they have every single organization that has set a science-based target included in an Excel spreadsheet that you can download. And that's a really nice way because most organizations that have set a science-based targets have quite sophisticated reporting. So they are very nice programs usually around sustainability in general, and carbon is very often a part of that. And they have great annual reports with really nice information. So you can get information in there on how you might want to talk about your carbon emissions. You can get information on how do you talk about your carbon reductions or increases over time, because a lot of them will have done that quite nicely. And also give you really nice inspiration on what kind of infographics you might want to use to make your carbon information a bit more understandable to the general public. So that's really one thing that I recommend everyone to do if you're thinking about how can I beef up our reporting, or where do I start, or I just want to get some really good examples, and then go in and download that spreadsheet and go in and have a look at some of those organizations. Another thing that I just wanted to quickly mention as well is there is a framework in the UK called the Streamline Energy and Carbon Reporting Framework. If you just wanted to understand what are some of the things that I might be expected to report, and I just want to try to start gathering the information for that, could look at some of the things that they have under that standard and what you should be including under that. There is a whole range of reporting frameworks around as well that you could have a look at, and if you're not thinking about what you might want to include in your reports. Keeping in mind that some organizations like to report on their full inventory, others might just choose the ones that are really relevant, or you might want to start slowly internally and talk about your air travel, for example, and then over time build the data and the information and the confidence to report on emissions. I do find that most organizations want to have started some reduction projects before they're ready to report. But again, I do see some sustainability managers nicely putting information out there and then use that as a leverage internally to reduce those emissions and get the buy-in internally. So there are different ways of doing that. Going to quickly also touch a little bit about COVID and what to think about. We're getting a lot of questions about this at the moment, and about how do you deal with reporting next year or later in this year when we see the results and the carbon footprints that the COVID-19 lockdown had here in New Zealand. So I've just given an example here of a graph. You've got 3 different years worth of data for your scope 1, so that's your direct emissions, and your scope 2 is your indirect electricity and steam emissions, and then your indirect supply chain emissions under your scope 3. And an example here that I would like to give is, say your emissions have dropped under the lockdown, and you are compiling your final year is ending today, financial year is ending. You probably want to have a think about what is the impact that COVID has had, and what would the reductions or increases be without the lockdown. And a way to estimate that, as an example, could be to look at, well, what were our emissions last year at the same time, and try to estimate, and are there any things that have changed? Did we have more output, for example? Did we have less or more revenue in this period? And try to compare what would the emissions have been without a lockdown, and what were they? Especially if you're thinking about trying to communicate internally or externally what your actual reductions have been, if everything was as business as usual. And the best way to do that is either to look at an average of a couple of 3 years back, or any point in time that you think is a relevant picture of what it would have been, and potentially show that on a graph like this and say, well, we estimate that our emissions actually dropped by 5,000 tons over the lockdown, and our overall reductions were 7,000. So we kind of allocate 2,000 to our reduction projects, whereas 5,000 are allocated to the COVID-19. Of course, some organizations might have an increase, and the same goes for there, where you could potentially estimate what would our emissions have been under a business as usual scenario, and what do we think the increase in our emissions are due to the COVID-19. And my biggest recommendation here would be to be very transparent. You probably will see a very large amount of annual reports with carbon information next year that will have mentioned COVID-19 and the impacts on the business. So I would say don't be afraid to actually mention that. And if you're operating internationally, you might even want to include some information on how was the lockdown here in New Zealand, how long was it for, what was the impact on the New Zealand economy, to give that background and understanding for anyone who's reading your reports. The key is really to just be transparent about it. And of course, if you're talking about it internally, your employees or your team is probably going to wonder what the emissions were, and what they could have been without a COVID lockdown. And here's just a quick example of an organization that I have just talked a little bit about potential increase here, sorry. And so again, just thinking about being transparent. If your emissions have gone up on the lockdown, being transparent about why you think that was. Potentially, some of the supermarkets will have probably quite a lot of increased business during the lockdown, so some of those footprints will probably have gone up. And so it's just about being transparent about why they have done that. When it comes to targets and target pathways, you might want to map out what happened here. So say this is 2020. You want to map out when you're talking either internally or externally about, well, this dip here, actually not all of it was due to our reduction projects. Majority of it was due to COVID lockdown, for example. And of course, the same goes if the peak, say the peak was for the lockdown and your emissions have actually gone up during that time. Marking that out, you'll see that if you look at inventories over a very long time, a lot of them will have a dip for the previous financial crisis. And so it's just about being transparent on what happened there. And of course, that helps you as well over time to when you do data analysis to average out there and remember that that year is looking a bit different, not necessarily just because of our reduction projects. One thing here as well to keep in mind is some organizations probably will have their inventories go, if they were going down during the lockdown, they probably would have gone or will go up a little bit once things pick up again. Hopefully you can keep your reduction pathway on a downward slope over time. But keep in mind that there's nothing unusual to have your emissions go up and down, depending a little bit on the economic activity. You know, as a way for some sustainability managers, it could be that you say, well, when we're setting targets, we want to make sure that we don't actually go above what the COVID year was. So you could capitalize on that opportunity here of saying, well, this is what our emissions should be. And this is going to be our absolute cap. We don't want our emissions to go above that. And so what was the pathway that we need to build to get onto that reduction pathway? And so again, just being really transparent. And one thing that I could recommend you as well is that have a think about what the learnings you've actually had during the lockdown. Maybe, for example, we learned that we can do things remotely. Talk a little bit about that and potentially what impact it had on your business and what impact it might have moving forward. Maybe it has changed the way you're going to do things in the future. Have a think about that. So just have a real good think about what COVID meant for you and your business. So that would be my recommendations, and there's a whole bunch of resources out there as well. Climate Leaders Coalition reporting is coming up soon. That has a questionnaire of things that it asks you to display, so that could be a good way for you to be guided on what you might want to talk about publicly. MFE has some great free tools online that you can start setting up your inventory if you haven't done that yet. We're here to help as well. Of course, we can help you with your measurement, your reductions, but also that public disclosure of your inventories. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Joe from the CDP, who's going to talk a little bit more about them and also give you a little bit of an update on CDP and relationship with the TCFD and what to think about there.
Okay, hello everyone. This is Joseph Gualtieri from CDP. Hope you can all see my screen.
Yeah.
You just great, we can. Okay, so yeah, thanks a lot, Ronja, for inviting me today, and thank you to all of you for attending. Yeah, my name is Joseph Gualtieri, and I'm on CDP's corporate and investor engagement teams. And building on what Ronja talked about, over the next few minutes, I'll just briefly introduce CDP and explain the role that we play in TCFD reporting. Okay, so we'll just begin with a brief look again at CDP and how we fit into the global corporate environmental disclosure system. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, CDP is a nonprofit organization that runs the world's leading corporate disclosure platform. And so in order to gather the corporate environmental data, we develop and issue questionnaires across 3 themes. And so these themes are climate change, water security, and deforestation. And so CDP issues requests for corporate environmental data on behalf of the 2 authority groups that you see here in the middle. So on top, we have our investor signatories. And on the bottom, we have large purchasing organizations, which use our supply chain program to request data from their suppliers. And this connects to what Ronja was saying a moment or two ago about how large organizations, as they build their Scope 3 inventory, will look for emissions reports from their suppliers. So on behalf of these two authority groups, we gather data through this process, and then it is shared with these two requesting authorities, so the investors, our investor signatories, and the purchasing organizations using our supply chain program. And the data is then goes on to inform the capital markets and to be accessible for civil and commercial actors who in turn use the data to drive action on environmental change. And so as you can see in the graphic located just to the left, our questionnaires are aligned with the TCFD. Okay, so here just a quick snapshot of some numbers to give you a sense of our operations. So last year, for 2019, we had over 8,400 companies worldwide submit responses to CDP. And of those, around 2,500 came from Asia Pacific region, and around 100 were in Australia and New Zealand. And as I mentioned, these companies will have responded either to a request for information on behalf of our 515 signatories, who as of 2020 have a total of 106 trillion US dollars in assets among them, or the 150 plus large purchasing organizations that use our supply chain program. And these organizations represent around $4 trillion in annual procurement spend. And also we have a city, states, and region program through which subnational governments can report on their actions to safeguard and against climate change, around 920 in total, including 5 in New Zealand, in particular Auckland and Wellington City Councils, both of which made our A-list for top performing subnational governments in 2019. So here just a slightly closer look at our disclosures in New Zealand. So the sample for our investor request for climate change in New Zealand is the NZX 50. So this means if you're a company in the NZX 50, we have requested environmental data from you on behalf of our investor signatories. And in addition to these listed companies, our signatories will also request information from a small number of companies that are not on the NZX 50, but which are judged to have an outsized environmental impact. And finally, a number of New Zealand-based vendors will be requested to respond to customers, again, through our supply chain program. And as you can see here, we had 20 companies respond to CDP requests last year. That's up from 14 in 2018. And it's a pretty good spread. So we have responding companies representing a large number of sectors and industries. And we certainly hope to see this increase in responses in the coming years. Okay, so I hope that gives you just a brief sense of how CDP operates both globally and within the New Zealand context. And so now I'd like to just move on to a closer look at how CDP intersects specifically with TCFD reporting. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the TCFD, but if you're not, it might be helpful to just take a quick recap of what the TCFD is and how it fits into the global efforts to limit climate change. So as you're probably aware, in 2015, just over 190, I believe 195 countries came together to sign the Paris Agreement, which aimed to limit the rise in global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels, and indeed to strive for a reduction of less than 1.5 degrees. And so in the context of this agreement, G20 finance ministers asked an organization called the Financial Stability Board to review how climate-related risks were being priced and accounted for. And this led to the FSB, the Financial Stability Board, setting up the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And they were tasked with preparing guidelines for companies to measure and monitor and ultimately report on and manage climate-related issues. And the task force comprised financial institutions, companies from other sectors, and a number of other stakeholders. And so as an industry-led organization that was working in close concert both with national governments and the international climate regime, it's sort of become to be seen as increasingly as a gold standard for reporting on climate risks. So ultimately, if we look to the right, you'll see that the TCFD issued a series of recommendations, which are really grouped around the 4 pillars of disclosure that we see here. So we have governance, we have strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And each of these pillars carries recommendations for specific types of disclosure corresponding to each of these pillars. And that comes to a total of 11 recommendations, which we'll look at in just a moment. Okay, so in this schematic, I wanted to visualize just how CDP aligns its questionnaire with the recommendations of the TCFD. So as we said, TCFD recommendations proceed from the starting point that climate change poses very significant financial risk. And the 4 pillars and recommendations are meant to indicate to investors what kind of questions they should be asking and what kind of data they should be evaluating, both in terms of their direct operations, their own companies, and in terms of investments. So proceeding from there, we use our climate change questionnaire, which provides breakdowns of the recommendations from the TCFD, and it converts these into accessible metrics, which are in turn designed to elicit data that will allow stakeholders to evaluate company performance against the TCFD recommendations. Moving on, our guidance material and supporting content are really designed to tell the companies exactly what data each question is asking for, the amount of information that needs to be provided in order to meet the recommendations of the TCFD. And a lot of companies that are earlier, that are at an earlier stage in their environmental stewardship journey will use our questionnaire to identify, collect, and ultimately report the relevant data. They'll use it as a framework for improving their environmental operations. And then our scoring incentivizes companies to, again, provide that level of detail in fulsome disclosure and rewards companies for following best practice. So what is the outcome of this? Well, the outcome is a set of TCFD aligned data that is standardized, that is comparable, and decision useful data. The idea being that a structured questionnaire yields structured data sets, and this in turn will provide stakeholders with actionable insight. Okay, so here we just see some of the nuts and bolts of how it is that we align with our questionnaire. So along the top here in these different colors, you'll see the 4 pillars of the TCFD. So again, we have governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. And then below in each of these columns, we see that these pillars carry specific disclosure guidelines that I mentioned. It's the 11 recommended disclosures, and those are listed alphabetically. And then to the right of those, the red codes, besides the recommendations, refer to the corresponding questions in our climate change questionnaire. So this is how we connect through these questions, these recommended disclosures to our questionnaire. So without going into much greater detail about this slide, what we find is that several questions are devoted to each of the 4 TCFD pillars and indeed each of the recommendations. And that yields a total of 25 TCFD aligned questionnaires. And in practical terms, for a company that's considering reporting or looking at the various options, I think the key takeaway here is that every company that completes CDP's climate change questionnaire is also, by virtue of doing so, producing a TCFD aligned report that draws on data that will be comparable across companies and across sectors. Okay, so here, just to emphasize the degree of alignment between CDP and TCFD, I've reproduced the findings of an organization called the Corporate Reporting Dialogue. And this was a joint effort set up by the 4 organizations that you see here to the right. So that's us, CDP, we have GRI, SASB, and IR, Integrated Reporting. And last year, these organizations came together and published the results of its Better Alignment project, which evaluated each framework's degree of alignment with the recommendations of the TCFD. And so what you'll notice is that among the 4 frameworks, CDP is the only one that features full alignment with the TCFD recommendations. And so while it may be possible to use other frameworks here and elsewhere to produce a TCFD aligned report, the CDP framework really is uniquely positioned to produce a full-fledged TCFD report. And of course, this is no accident. I mean, as I indicated, our questionnaire is specifically designed to maximize alignment with the TCFD recommendations. And as such, we certainly welcome the prospect of the increased focus and possible imposition of mandatory TCFD alignment. Okay, so just to drill down just a little bit deeper and to illustrate how our questionnaires, how our individual questions are tied to the TCFD recommendations. So in this slide, I've just zoomed into the recommendations recommendation C in the strategy pillar, which directs companies to describe their resilience strategy with respect to different scenarios, including a 2-degree scenario. And this aligns with 2 questions in our questionnaire. So that's question C3.1A and C3.1D. So in C3.1A, companies are asked to indicate whether and how they've used climate-related scenario analysis to inform and improve their business strategy. And so companies that have used scenario analysis are then prompted to provide the relevant details to their analysis, so they can tell the stakeholders whether the analysis was quantitative, qualitative, or both. And the question also allows companies to choose from various standards that are in common use. So they can choose from scenarios that are put forth, for example, by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, and other scenarios in common use. Okay, so that was 3.1A, and in question 3.1D, companies are asked to describe where and how the climate-related risks and opportunities have influenced their business strategy. So here, companies can detail their strategy with respect to products and services, value chain and supply chain, investment in R&D, and their direct and indirect operations. And companies are incentivized to provide company-specific details and case studies for strategic decisions that are relevant to each of those business areas, and to do so with reference to relevant time horizons, inputs, assumptions, and the analytical methods used in the scenario analysis. And companies that do not use scenario analysis are also given the opportunity to either explain why they do not, or to describe any plans to begin to do so. Okay, so in here, I just put some extracts from sample responses that scored full points on this question. So as you can see, the response covers each of the elements of the requested content and paints a vivid picture of the findings of the company's scenario analysis. They also go into how the results of the scenario analysis have informed the company's strategic orientation. And what we find is that providing this information really signals that a company has a clear vision of its place in a low carbon economy. To use Ronja's term from a few minutes ago, it really indicates that a company is taking efforts to future-proof its business. And this allows stakeholders to clearly see really the degree of planning and the level of depth that a company has used to identify its place in each scenario reported on. So hopefully this gives you a sense of what I mean when I say that CDP's questionnaire produces structured, decision useful data. So of course, again, a company could provide the same information in its own report or through other reporting channels. But I would say that CDP reporting carries the benefit of really providing stakeholders with uniform data that is comparable both among companies, so that stakeholders can compare environmental performance of companies both within and across sectors, and also over time, so that stakeholders can track a company's performance and identify trends from year to year. So on that note, where does all this data go? Who ultimately gets it? So as you can see here, CDP occupies a central position in the ESG data ecosystem. And so the information that you submit reaches not only CDP's investor signatories, we talked about a moment ago, but also the users of the various data channels, outlets, and organizations that you can see here. So for example, ISS will use CDP data to assign its ESG corporate ratings, while Stocks, Goldman Sachs, Euronext, and others, increasing number of others actually, will use CDP data to create specialized environmentally focused indices. Likewise, S&P Global, FTSE Russell, MSCI, and others all license CDP data, climate data for use in their own products. And so what this tells us is that by filling out a CDP report, you not only fulfill the requirements of TCFD reporting and engage with your direct stakeholders, but you do so in a way that that allows your reporting to connect with global financial markets. We found that this really does carry a number of benefits. So companies that disclose through CDP ranked 19 percentiles better than average than the average firm in their ability to access capital, according to a study last year by the Canadian ESG consultancy Milani. We've also seen from last year research from Oxford and Maastricht universities that found that companies disclosing environmental data of the type captured in a CDP report generally have a lower cost of capital. So in some cases, saving up to $1.1 million per loan per year in interest payments. And also, and according to our own studies of our responding companies, we found that just about 1 in 3 say that disclosing helps them save money. And over half say that disclosing helps them to be more competitive. And again, this is not only in terms of using the framework to guide their progress towards environmental stewardship, but also in terms of using the amplification effect that we see here to make sure that that progress is seen and appreciated. Okay, so with that, if you're interested in submitting a TCFD report through CDP, please remember that the deadline this year is August 26th. As I mentioned, if you're an NZX50 company, you have been requested to respond this year. If you're not able to locate your invitation email, please just go ahead and reach out to me and we'll send it to you. If you've not been asked to respond, you're still welcome to submit through CDP as what we call a self-selected company. And again, you can get in touch with me for more information on how to do that. And finally, if you're considering responding or just would like to know more about TCFD or CDP, then please feel free to review the resources linked here. Okay, and so with that, I will thank you very much for your attention, and I will turn it back over to Ronja.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was very interesting. I know a lot of organizations are wondering a bit more about CDP and interconnection with TCFD and reporting, etc. So that was super useful. I've got 2 questions. Joe, I'm going to attempt to answer them and I'll let you come in with some comments if you feel like it.
Great.
I had a great question that we have received quite a bit. And the question is how to deal with reductions and reduction pathways if the coronavirus lockdown has led to a more flexible workplace where staff don't really have to go back to the office, and how do you work around that? So I've got a few comments around that. One of the first one would be that I'd recommend that you try to evaluate or estimate what the emissions associated with people working from home are. And so majority of those emissions will be your waste to landfill and your electricity. And what you want to try to do is to understand if they are material, in which case you should then consider whether you should include them under your inventory. Because essentially, even if your employees are working from home, if they are doing the work on your behalf, you should consider whether they are material and whether you should include them under your inventory. And if they are material, you potentially would want to try to understand what might they be, how can we improve the information of that over time, and see how can you support your employees reduce their emissions from their households. One analogy that I can give you is what we often ask organizations that have outsourced activities to estimate what the emissions would be if those were in-house activities. So, and the idea is that you would include emissions from outsourced activities if they are material, with the likes that if they were in-house activities, you would include them. So it's a bit of a similar case there. So then I would recommend that you try to understand what is your organization's place in trying to help people working from home reduce their emissions of their households. There is a little bit of information that I can probably send out in an information pack after this session. There was some research done in the UK around how do you actually get better information on employees' home emissions. Some of them are, I guess, built on vaguer assumptions, and others are going down to more detail. But of course, you know, I guess the thing you want to think about then is whether your staff are ready to answer questions about their household situation. I would also, one thing that I just would also recommend that you do consider is, will you have any stakeholders that will have an expectation on you including emissions from your staff working from home? And if the answer to that is yes, then potentially you do want to try to estimate what those emissions are. Of course, if you had all your staff in your office, it'd probably be a little bit easier to estimate those emissions because you'd have larger control of them. Whereas, of course, if you are going to include electricity associated or waste to landfill associated emissions from people working from home, your level of control will be lower, and therefore also the initiatives or the activities that you might want to undertake in terms of trying to reduce those emissions will have to reflect that as well. So we're probably moving into that nudging and supporting your staff and to live a healthier and lower emissions lifestyle. I also have another question here around companies that have already set a science-based target and had it approved. Will they be updating their target due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so that the reductions from the pandemic are not included into the I guess the target pathway? My answer to that is that a science-based target is a long-term target, 5 to 15 years time frame. I think we're probably too early into that evaluation to be able to have organizations deciding on resetting a target just yet. And then I guess one of the main things with the science-based target is that long-term nature. And what is going to be interesting to see is how do those emissions evolve over the next few years. And another note on that as well is that a lot of organizations that have set science-based targets, they would also have had a look at what the emissions are for intensity, for example, based on the revenue or per product output or similar. So probably a little bit too early still. Joe, I've got another question for you in terms of how the TCFD aligns with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and in turn, how does the CDP questionnaire reflect this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. In terms of how the TCFD aligns with the SDGs. Would clearly align with 13 and 7, which are on energy and climate change. This is the ones that come to mind immediately. I can certainly in the follow-up materials provide a more fulsome explanation of that. But also CDP as well makes efforts to align with the SDG goals. And if you look through our questionnaire guidance documents, you'll see all of the instances where particular questions align with this particular SDGs. Again, most of those, particularly in the case of climate change, will again go to SDGs 13 and 7, but also our forest questionnaire, of course, would be very closely linked to the one on life on land, our water, life, marine life, and so on and so forth. But yeah, those, you can get that question level indication of linkages in our guidance materials, which are linked to in the slides that we'll send out following today's discussion.
Joe, a question on that. So say an organization has aligned some of their reporting or some of their activities with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Mm-hmm. Do you say that when they submit to the CDP, would they include some information on that as an appendix or a link to say an annual report, or what do you usually see there?
Yeah, so that would provide excellent context, and this goes back to the previous question. So in most of these questions, there will be a text field where the responding company can give further explanation or details or context on how the information that they're reporting fits into the bigger picture, either in terms of their overall operations or in terms of these other initiatives or frameworks. So yeah, I certainly would encourage companies to include reference to those other goals in the text fields that accompany most of the questions.
Great. What's your most commonly asked question at the moment, and gearing up for submitting to the CDP?
What the deadline is, I would have to say. Yeah. Which is the 26th of August. So, okay. Yeah, generally speaking, it will be toward the end of July. This year, in light of the disruptions caused by COVID-19, we've pushed that back to the end of August, just to give companies a little bit more time and breathing space to make the best report that they can.
Well, thank you everyone for joining today. I hope that you have found it useful. Thanks again for joining, and have a lovely Tuesday afternoon.
Thank you, Ron. Have a good day.
Cheers.
Bye.